My property sits nestled against the foothills, 20 acres of pristine woodland that has been in my family since my great-grandfather staked his claim in 1923. The modest cabin my grandfather built with his own hands stands at the center, its weathered logs and stone chimney a testament to simpler times. I grew up visiting this place every summer, learning to hunt, fish, and respect the land from my father, just as he had learned from his father before him. When my parents passed away 5 years ago, there was no question where I would make my home. The city had grown too loud, too fast, too impersonal. Here, surrounded by towering pines and the gentle soundtrack of nature, I could breathe. My wife agreed it would be the perfect place to raise our two children, away from the constant noise and pressure of urban life. We renovated the cabin, adding modern comforts while preserving its rustic character. Our first 3 years were idyllic. We established routines around the rhythms of nature rather than the demands of society. My children learned to identify animal tracks in mud, to know which berries were safe to eat, and to navigate by landmarks instead of GPS. The hunting path that wound through the eastern section of our property became their favorite adventure route, the same path my grandfather had cut by hand decades ago, the same path we had used to carry my father to his final resting place beneath the old oak at the property edge. Then the development started. At first, it was just rumors at the general store about luxury homes planned for the adjacent ridge. I paid little attention. My property was protected by decades of legal documentation, including grandfather clauses that exempted us from most county regulations. The developers would do what developers do, but my little corner of paradise would remain untouched. I was wrong. The Whispering Pines luxury community rose like an alien civilization across the ridge, massive homes with manicured lawns, a neighborhood that seemed transported from suburban California into our rugged landscape. More concerning was the letter that arrived 6 months after construction began, welcoming me to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. There must be some mistake, I told my wife as I reviewed the attached map showing our property inside their jurisdiction boundaries. Our deed predates their development by a century. I called their offices the next morning, explaining the situation calmly and logically. The woman on the phone assured me that while technically our property fell within their mapped area, our grandfather clauses would exempt us from most of their regulations. Most became the operative word in the months that followed. First came notices about our woodpile being unsightly from the main road. Then complaints about the deer carcasses we hung during hunting season. Each time, I responded with copies of our exemption paperwork, and each time the issues temporarily subsided. Then he appeared, Martin Blackwell, the newly appointed HOA compliance inspector. His crisp khaki pants, polo shirts with the embroidered HOA logo, and gleaming SUV became an unwelcome sight at our property line. Initially, his visits were brief and superficially polite as he took notes on his clipboard about potential violations, while standing just at the edge of our property. "Just doing my job," he would say with a tight smile that never reached his eyes, "making sure all properties maintain community standards." I tolerated these boundary inspections, secure in our legal protections. But then I noticed his gaze lingering on our hunting path. The narrow dirt trail that meandered through the eastern woods was barely visible from the property line, but something about it seemed to catch his attention. The way his eyes tracked its course through the trees made my skin crawl with unease. "Beautiful property you have," he remarked during his fourth visit, nodding toward the path. "Where does that trail lead?" "Family land," I answered curtly. "Private." He nodded and made another note on his clipboard, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Looking back, that was the moment everything changed, the moment our sanctuary became contested ground. The first sign of trouble came after a heavy spring rain. I was walking the property line, checking for storm damage, when unusual marks in the mud caught my attention. Tire tracks too wide for an ATV, too narrow for a truck, cut across our posted boundary and continued toward the hunting path. Someone in a passenger vehicle had deliberately driven onto our property. I followed the tracks, my concern growing with each step. They led directly to our hunting path and continued for nearly a quarter mile before turning around at the creek crossing. Whoever had done this had ignored the 3 private property, no trespassing signs posted at regular intervals. I documented everything with my phone, taking clear photographs of the tire impressions and their path across our clearly marked boundary. That evening, I drafted a polite but firm email to the HOA board, attaching the photos and requesting they remind their staff about respecting private property boundaries. Their response came 3 days later. The HOA compliance team occasionally needs access to all properties within our jurisdiction map for environmental and safety assessments. We appreciate your cooperation. I responded immediately, citing our grandfather clauses and legal exemptions, emphasizing that no one had requested or received permission to drive vehicles on our land. The board president replied with vague assurances they would look into the matter. 2 weeks passed without incident. Then, after another rainstorm, fresh tracks appeared, the same tire pattern, following the same route, but penetrating even deeper into our property. This time, there were signs that the vehicle had stopped at several points along the path, as though the driver had gotten out to examine something. "This has to be Blackwell," I told my wife that evening. "No one else would have the nerve." She suggested installing trail cameras, and the next day I mounted one on the gnarled oak that marked the entrance to our hunting path. I positioned it carefully to capture both the posted signs and any vehicle that might pass them. For 5 days, the camera recorded only wildlife and our family's own movements. On the 6th day, it captured exactly what I suspected: Martin Blackwell's black SUV rolling past our property markers, slowing to a stop beside the first "No Trespassing" sign. The footage clearly showed him reading the sign, then deliberately proceeding forward. Additional clips showed him exiting his vehicle at various points along our hunting path, taking photographs and making notes. Most disturbing was his demeanor, not someone making an honest mistake, but a man who clearly believed he had every right to be there. His posture radiated entitlement as he examined trees and soil samples, meticulously documenting what he clearly considered violations on land my family had stewarded for generations before his HOA existed. Armed with this evidence, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, attaching the video footage and requesting immediate action. I emphasized that this was not merely a boundary dispute, but documented trespassing. The response was both swift and dismissive. Our compliance inspector has authority to access all properties within our jurisdiction map to maintain community standards. Your property, while enjoying certain exemptions from aesthetic requirements, remains subject to environmental and safety inspections. Meanwhile, the damage to our hunting path mounted. What had once been a narrow trail of packed earth, designed for foot travel and the occasional ATV during hunting season, now showed distinct vehicle ruts. After heavy rains, these ruts channeled water, causing erosion that had never been an issue before. The delicate ecosystem alongside the path showed signs of disruption: native plants crushed under tires, wildlife corridors interrupted. My next encounter with Blackwell came when I caught him actually on our property, His SUV parked halfway down our hunting path. I approached him calmly but firmly. "You are trespassing on private property," I stated, pointing to the nearby signs. "Please leave immediately." He turned slowly, his expression a mixture of surprise and contempt. "I am conducting an official inspection," he replied, holding up his clipboard like a shield. "This property falls under HOA jurisdiction." "We have legal exemptions, as you know," I countered. "And nothing in those HOA documents gives you the right to drive vehicles on our private trails." His smile never reached his eyes. "Perhaps you should review the HOA charter more carefully. As compliance inspector, I have access rights to all properties. Your grandfather clauses exempt you from certain aesthetic requirements, not from necessary inspections." "Necessary for what?" I demanded. He gestured vaguely around. "This entire area is an eyesore compared to the rest of the community. Dead trees, unmaintained trails, potential fire hazards. Someone has to ensure minimum standards are maintained." As he returned to his vehicle, he added, "Expect a formal notice of violations by the end of the week. The board will determine appropriate penalties." I watched him drive away, his SUV carving deeper ruts into my grandfather's path, knowing that the battle lines had been drawn. What had begun as a minor boundary dispute was evolving into something far more personal, a challenge to not just my property rights, but to my family legacy. The morning after my confrontation with Blackwell, I walked the hunting path alone, my boots sinking into the mud his SUV had churned up. This narrow trail contained more family history than any photo album or heirloom could haul. My great-grandfather had first cut this path to access the eastern forest for hunting. My grandfather had widened it just enough for his old ATV. My father had maintained it meticulously every spring, clearing fallen branches and reinforcing erosion-prone sections. This was the path where I had shot my first deer at 12 years old, my father standing proudly behind me. The same path we had used as a processional route when we carried my grandfather's handmade casket to his favorite fishing spot, where he had requested to be buried. The soil beneath my feet had absorbed 5 generations of my family's footsteps, our sweat, our stories. Now that sacred ground showed the scars of Blackwell's trespassing, deep tire ruts from his heavy SUV, widening what should have remained a narrow trail. The damage went beyond mere aesthetics. The ruts had altered water drainage patterns, creating new erosion channels that threatened the stability of the entire path. Native vegetation along the edges had been crushed under his tires. Most concerning was the absence of wildlife signs near the path. The deer tracks that typically crisscross this area had vanished, the animals clearly spooked by the frequent vehicle intrusions. I took detailed photographs of the damage, adding them to my growing documentation. That afternoon, I drove into town to meet with Alan Bergman, the only property attorney within 50 miles. His small office above the hardware store was cramped but meticulously organized, the walls lined with law books and framed credentials. Alan reviewed my evidence thoroughly, his expression growing more serious with each document and photograph. "You have a strong case for trespassing," he admitted. "Your property boundaries are well established, your exemptions are clearly documented, and your no trespassing signs are properly posted." "So I can take legal action?" I asked. His hesitation told me everything. "You can, but I need to be honest about what that entails. The HOA has deep pockets and a team of corporate attorneys. They can drag this out for years. The legal fees alone could bankrupt you." I left his office with a folder of legal options I could not afford to pursue and a growing sense of helplessness. The system designed to protect property rights seemed calibrated to favor those with the resources to endure lengthy legal battles. Meanwhile, Blackwell's harassment intensified. His inspections increased from weekly to almost daily. Most alarming was when my wife called me at work, her voice tight with anger, to tell me she had caught him photographing our children as they played in the front yard. He claimed he was documenting unsafe play equipment, she said. Our children's swing set, the one your father built. That evening, as we walked the property boundary together, we discovered fresh survey stakes placed well inside our property line, an apparent attempt to redraw boundaries that had stood for a century. The final straw came 3 days later. While checking our trail cameras, I discovered that the fox den that had existed beside the hunting path for decades, a den my children had monitored each spring to watch the new kits emerge, had been abandoned. The entrance was partially collapsed, likely from the vibrations of Blackwell's vehicle passing too close. That night, lying awake beneath the ceiling beams my grandfather had hewn by hand, I reached a decision. The legal system offered no immediate protection. The HOA continued to ignore my documented complaints. My family's heritage was being eroded with each pass of Blackwell's SUV. The breaking point had arrived not with rage but with crystal clarity. I had exhausted all reasonable options. Now I needed to protect what was mine through other means. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, I knew exactly what had to be done. The next morning marked the beginning of my methodical research phase. I cleared my kitchen table, creating a workspace dominated by legal texts borrowed from the county library, printouts of state property laws, and notebooks filled with my increasingly detailed observations. My laptop displayed forums where other rural property owners discussed their strategies for dealing with trespassers and boundary disputes. Property law became my evening obsession after the children were in bed. I highlighted relevant statutes and annotated court cases where landowners had successfully defended their rights against encroachment. I learned the precise legal definition of trespassing in our state and the specific protections afforded to historic properties like ours. 3 days into my research, I discovered a crucial legal principle that would shape my plan. Property owners maintain the right to protect private access roads from unauthorized vehicles, provided they gave adequate warning. The key requirement was that any protective measures must be clearly visible and preceded by appropriate signage. Not hidden traps designed to cause harm, but obvious deterrents that trespassers would have to deliberately ignore. With this legal foundation established, I began researching vehicle deterrents. Commercial options existed, but would leave a paper trail I preferred to avoid. Besides, many were designed for permanent installation, while I needed something that could be deployed selectively when needed. I called Jack Reynolds, a family friend who had served 20 years in military security before retiring to a cabin 10 miles from us. His expertise in perimeter protection made him the perfect consultant. Rather than calling or emailing, I drove to his property one evening, bringing along my documentation and legal research. Jack listened without judgment as I explained the situation, examining the photographs of damage to our hunting path and reviewing the footage of Blackwell's repeated trespassing. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You need something legal but effective," he said, pulling out a sheet of graph paper. "Something that gives clear warning but has real consequences for those who ignore it." Over the next 2 hours, we sketched designs for a retractable spike strip that could be deployed remotely. The mechanism would remain hidden under a metal plate when not in use, but when activated, would raise a visible row of spikes capable of puncturing vehicle tires. Most importantly, it could be preceded by multiple warning signs, making it a legal deterrent rather than a concealed trap. The key is documentation and warning, Jack emphasized. Cameras to record the trespasser ignoring signs, multiple warnings at different distances, and the device itself must be visible when deployed. The design finalized, I began gathering materials. I was careful to space out my purchases across different hardware stores in neighboring counties, paying cash for everything. From one store, heavy-gauge steel plates. From another, the hydraulic mechanism that would raise and lower the spikes. From a third, the control system and weatherproof housing. In my workshop behind the cabin, I began assembly. The work was precise and slow, each component carefully fitted to ensure reliability. The spike strip itself featured 6 hardened steel points, sturdy enough to puncture tires but not so sharp as to cause catastrophic blowouts that might lead to a dangerous crash. The hydraulic system was robust yet simple, designed to operate reliably in all weather conditions. I installed a remote control system with a range of half a mile, allowing me to deploy the barrier from a safe observation point. Testing consumed another week. I used an old tractor tire mounted on a frame to verify that the spikes would puncture effectively without causing explosive deflation. I confirmed the remote system worked reliably from various distances and angles. I tested the weatherproofing by running a garden hose over the installed unit for an hour, ensuring no water penetrated the electrical components. The final phase involved creating proper warning signs. I designed them to be unmistakable, bright yellow with bold black text. Warning: private road, no trespassing vehicle barriers in use. I had them professionally printed on reflective metal at a sign shop 2 counties away, explaining they were for a private mining operation. Installation day arrived with perfect conditions, a heavy morning fog that provided natural concealment. I selected the optimal location on our hunting path, just past the first curve but still visible from the entrance. I dug the necessary recess in the packed earth, installed the housing and mechanism, then carefully concealed the power supply and control lines. When retracted, the device was barely noticeable, just a metal plate that resembled a small bridge over a drainage channel. When deployed, it presented an unmistakable row of tire spikes spanning the entire width of the path. With equal care, I installed the warning signs. The first at the property boundary, clearly visible to anyone approaching the hunting path. The second 50 yards along the path, impossible to miss. The third just before the curve that led to the spike strip itself. Each sign was mounted at eye level, with reflective backing to ensure visibility even in poor light conditions. As the fog lifted, I surveyed my work. This was not about vengeance but protection, a legal barrier against a persistent trespasser who had ignored all reasonable requests to respect our property. The system was fair, providing ample warning before consequences. Now came the waiting game. The days following the installation settled into a routine of vigilant monitoring. Each morning began with a careful inspection of the hunting path, checking that all warning signs remained in place and clearly visible. I downloaded footage from the trail cameras daily, documenting that the system remained untriggered and that no trespassers had approached. A week passed, without incident. Then another. I began to wonder if Blackwell had somehow gotten wind of my preparations and decided our property was no longer worth the hassle. Perhaps the explicit warning signs alone had achieved my goal of protecting our land. Then came a crisp Tuesday morning in early October. The children had just left for school, and I was enjoying a cup of coffee on the front porch when movement at the property boundary caught my eye. Through the morning mist, The unmistakable black SUV appeared, moving slowly along our perimeter. I retrieved my binoculars from inside and took up position on the porch. Through the lenses, I could clearly see Martin Blackwell behind the wheel, his HOA logo polo shirt visible through the windshield. He paused at our property line, consulting something on his clipboard before reaching a decision. The SUV turned, its tires crushing the grass as it headed directly toward the entrance to our hunting path. My heart rate quickened as I watched him approach the first warning sign. He stopped, reading the bright yellow notice, then shook his head dismissively. With deliberate slowness, he continued forward, the SUV lurching slightly as it transitioned from grass to the packed earth of our trail. I moved quickly, retrieving the remote control from inside the house and heading toward the ridge that overlooked the eastern section of our property. From this vantage point, I could see the entire length of the hunting path, including all 3 warning signs and the location of the spike strip. Through the binoculars, I watched as Blackwell approached the second warning sign. Again, he stopped briefly, clearly reading the notice. Again, he proceeded forward with a dismissive wave of his hand, as though the warnings applied to everyone but him. As he rounded the bend and approached the third and final warning, I raised my phone and began recording video. The documentation would be crucial for whatever followed. Through the phone screen, I captured clear footage of Blackwell stopping at the final warning sign, reading it thoroughly, and then deliberately driving forward. The moment of decision arrived. I could still choose not to deploy the barrier, to find some other way to handle this violation. But as I watched his SUV crush native plants beside our path, carving deeper ruts into the trail my ancestors had created, a quiet resolve settled over me. This was not impulsive revenge, but the necessary protection of something precious. I pressed the button on the remote. Through my phone's camera, I captured the hydraulic system smoothly raising the row of hardened steel spikes across the path. The barrier was fully deployed and clearly visible for several seconds before Blackwell's SUV reached it. There was no opportunity for him to claim he had not seen it. No possibility that this was an unavoidable accident. He made a conscious choice to continue driving directly over the clearly visible spike strip. The sound carried across the property, the distinctive hiss of air escaping tires as the SUV lurched forward then dropped abruptly, settling on its rims. All 4 tires had been punctured simultaneously, leaving the vehicle stranded in the middle of our hunting path. For several seconds, Blackwell remained inside, his expression transitioning from confusion to disbelief to rage. Then the driver's door flew open, and he exploded from the vehicle, circling it to inspect the damage while unleashing a stream of profanity loud enough to carry across the distance. When he spotted the deployed spike strip, his face contorted with fury. He pulled out his phone, jabbing at the screen with angry motions, then held it to his ear while gesturing wildly at his disabled vehicle. I continued recording as I made my way down from the ridge, approaching at a measured pace. By the time I reached the scene, Blackwell had worked himself into a full tantrum, kicking at his flattened tires and alternating between threats directed at me and demands for immediate assistance from whoever was on the other end of his call. "You have destroyed county property," he shouted when he saw me approaching. "This is criminal vandalism. You will be arrested and sued for damages." I maintained a calm demeanor, keeping a safe distance while continuing to record. "You have trespassed on clearly marked private property," I replied evenly. "You passed 3 separate warning signs indicating vehicle barriers were in use. The spike strip was fully deployed and visible before you drove over it. I am an HOA compliance inspector conducting official business," he bellowed, his face reddening further. "I have every right to access this property." "No, you do not," I stated firmly. "My property has documented exemptions from HOA inspection requirements. You have been notified of this in writing multiple times. You have been warned verbally about trespassing. Today, you ignored 3 separate written warnings about CLE barriers." His phone call connected, and I could hear him demanding police response for criminal property damage and assault. When he hung up, he pointed a trembling finger at me. "The sheriff will be here in 20 minutes. I am pressing charges for destruction of property, assault with a deadly weapon, and reckless endangerment." "I look forward to speaking with them," I replied calmly. As we waited, neighbors from the properties adjoining the development began to arrive, drawn by the commotion. Several approached, asking what had happened. Blackwell attempted to control the narrative, claiming I had set a dangerous trap that had nearly killed him. To my surprise, multiple neighbors immediately disputed his version. "We saw him drive right past the warning signs," one elderly woman stated firmly. "My husband and I were walking along the ridge and watched the whole thing. Those yellow signs are visible from 100 yards away." Another neighbor nodded in agreement. He stopped and read each sign, then drove forward anyway. "We've all seen how he treats property boundaries around here." When the sheriff's deputies arrived 30 minutes later, I was prepared. I handed them a folder containing our property deed, documentation of our HOA exemptions, copies of my previous complaints about trespassing, photographs of the damage Blackwell had caused to our hunting path, and the video evidence showing him deliberately ignoring the warning signs before encountering the spike strip. The deputies reviewed the evidence carefully, walking the path to inspect all 3 warning signs and the spike strip itself. They interviewed the neighbors who had witnessed Blackwell's actions. Throughout their investigation, Blackwell continued to demand my arrest, his voice growing increasingly desperate as he realized the direction their inquiry was taking. After nearly an hour, the senior deputy approached me. "Your deterrent system appears to be legal, sir. Clear signage, visible barrier on private property with documented no trespassing notices." He turned to Blackwell. "From what we can determine, you knowingly trespassed on private property after ignoring multiple warnings. We will not be filing charges against the property owner." Blackwell's face went pale, then flushed red again. "This is outrageous. I will have both of you fired. The HOA lawyers will destroy you." The deputy remained professional but firm. "You are welcome to contest this decision through proper channels. For now, we can help arrange a tow truck for your vehicle, but it will need to exit along the property boundary, not further along this private trail." As Blackwell continued his tirade, I felt no triumph or vindication, only relief that the system had worked as designed. The confrontation had been recorded, witnessed, and properly assessed by law enforcement. This was not about revenge, but about establishing boundaries that would be respected. The aftermath began unfolding immediately. The deputies completed their report on site, providing me with an incident number and confirmation that no charges would be filed against me. Their official documentation stated clearly, "Property owner exercised legal right to protect private access road from unauthorized vehicles after providing adequate warning." Blackwell refused to accept this outcome. As the tow truck winched his disabled SUV onto its flatbed, he continued making phone calls, his voice carrying threats of lawsuits, professional consequences for the deputies, and making an example of me. By evening, word of the incident had spread throughout the Whispering Pines community. My phone began ringing with calls from neighbors I had barely met, some offering support, others expressing concern about escalating tensions between original landowners and the HOA. The next morning brought the expected certified letter from the HOA attorney, demanding the immediate removal of all hazardous devices from my property, payment for damages to Blackwell's vehicle, and a written apology for impeding an official HOA inspection. The letter threatened legal action if these demands were not met within 48 hours. I forwarded the letter to Alan Bergman, who had agreed to represent me on a contingency basis after reviewing the video evidence of Blackwell's trespassing. "This is standard intimidation," Alan assured me. "Their position is legally indefensible given the documentation we have." 3 days later, the HOA board called an emergency meeting at the community center. Though not officially invited, I attended along with Alan, sitting quietly in the back as board members assembled at the front table, their expressions grim. The board president, Margaret Harrington, called the meeting to order with forced calm. "We are here to address the unfortunate incident involving our compliance inspector's vehicle." Before she could continue, an older gentleman in the third row stood up. "I would like to speak first, if you do not mind." Without waiting for permission, he continued, "My name is Robert Chen. My property borders the east side of this gentleman's land." He gestured toward me. "For 6 months, I have watched your inspector trespass repeatedly on private property despite clear boundaries and posted signs." Margaret attempted to interrupt, but Robert continued firmly. "I have photographs of at least 12 separate incidents. I was also a witness when he deliberately drove past 3 separate warning signs before encountering the tire spikes." This unexpected support opened the floodgates. 3 other homeowners stood to share similar experiences: Blackwell entering their properties without permission, photographing through windows, and fabricating violations where none existed. The most damning testimony came from Elena Rodriguez, whose property featured a natural conservation area. "He threatened to fine me for protected wetland species that are legally permitted on my property," she stated firmly. "When I showed him the environmental exemption documents, he said he would find something else to cite me for." The meeting descended into chaos as homeowners began sharing grievances about overzealous enforcement and arbitrary rule interpretations. Margaret struggled to maintain order, finally pounding her gavel repeatedly. "This meeting is specifically about the dangerous trap that damaged HOA property." Alan stood then, his voice cutting through the noise. "If I may address that specific point, my client installed a legal vehicle barrier on private property with clear warning signs, all of which your inspector deliberately ignored after months of documented trespassing. We have video evidence of him reading each warning before proceeding." He placed a thick binder on the table. "This contains over 200 pages of documentation, property deeds with HOA exemptions clearly marked, copies of trespassing complaints that went unanswered, photographs of property damage caused by repeated unauthorized vehicle use, and witness statements attesting to your inspector's pattern of boundary violations." The HOA attorney whispered urgently to Margaret, whose expression shifted from confidence to concern as she flipped through the binder. After a hurried consultation with the board members, she announced a 30-minute recess. When the meeting reconvened, the tone had changed dramatically. "The board will be conducting a thorough review of inspection protocols," Margaret announced, her practiced smile strained. "In the meantime, Mr. Blackwell has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation." Outside the community center, local news vans had arrived, reporters requesting statements about the rural homeowner standing up to HOA tyranny. The story had somehow leaked to media outlets, framed as a David versus Goliath battle between original landowners and encroaching development. I declined interviews, but the story spread regardless. By the next day, my email inbox contained dozens of messages from property owners across the state sharing similar experiences, with HOAs overstepping their authority. Several offered financial support if my case went to court. The turning point came when 3 additional Whispering Pines residents filed formal complaints against Blackwell, complete with security footage showing him entering garages without permission, photographing through windows, and falsifying inspection reports. What had begun as my isolated property dispute had uncovered a pattern of abuse that affected the entire community. The HOA board, facing mounting public pressure and potential legal liability, called another emergency meeting. This one closed to the public. The following morning, I received a hand-delivered letter signed by all board members. They would be conducting a comprehensive internal review of inspection protocols and boundary enforcement. Most telling was Blackwell's conspicuous absence from the community in the days that followed. The black SUV no longer patrolled the neighborhood, and no replacement inspector appeared. The HOA had entered damage control mode, hoping to contain a public relations crisis that grew beyond their control with each passing day. 3 weeks after the confrontation, an official letter arrived on embossed HOA letterhead. The tone differed markedly from previous communications, formal, respectful, and notably lacking in threats. It contained an unequivocal apology for the unauthorized access to your private property and confirmation that Martin Blackwell had been terminated from his position. More significant was the attached legal agreement, drafted by their attorneys for my review. It formally exempted my entire property from all HOA inspections and regulations, with substantial financial penalties specified should any HOA representative cross our boundaries without explicit written permission. The document represented not moral. Why a victory, but complete vindication. After consulting with Allen, I signed the agreement, adding only one condition: that the HOA contribute to the restoration of the damaged hunting path. They agreed without hesitation, clearly eager to resolve the matter entirely. With the conflict officially resolved, I began the work of healing the land. The first step was removing the spike strip, now unnecessary with clear boundaries established. I restored that section of the path, filling the installation recess with the same native soil that generations of my family had walked upon. The following Saturday morning brought an unexpected sight: 3 trucks parked at our property line, and a group of neighbors standing awkwardly with shovels, native plant seedlings, and landscaping tools. Elena Rodriguez stepped forward as spokesperson. "We thought you might appreciate some help restoring your path," she said simply. "Many of us moved here because we value the natural landscape. What happened to your property could have happened to any of us." For the next several weekends, a rotating group of volunteers helped repair the damage Blackwell's SUV had caused. We reshaped the eroded sections, planted native ground cover to prevent future erosion, and installed subtle drainage channels to protect the path during heavy rains. As we worked side by side, conversations revealed shared values that transcended the artificial boundaries between the original properties and newer development. Many of the HOA residents had chosen Whispering Pines specifically for its natural setting, only to find themselves constrained by regulations that prioritized uniformity over environmental stewardship. "We never wanted to be the invasive species," Robert Chen remarked one afternoon as we restored a particularly damaged section of path. "Most of us moved here because We respect what this land has always been. Gradually, wildlife returned to the area. Deer tracks appeared in the freshly turned soil along the